Good day, everyone. This is Joseph Trevisani from Worldwide Markets. I thank you all for attending. Fascinating topic we have here today. We can take it almost anywhere we want. Before we get started, a couple of notes. I prefer interaction on these things, so if anyone has any questions, comments, as I always say, jokes, of which I'm not good at, please type them into the chat, and we will stop and take a look at what you have to say, and if we can, we'll discuss it and answer whatever questions we have. So let us commence without any further ado, as they say. Fascinating topic, Greece. But it's not really Greece that's the topic. It is really the European Union, the EMU, and the attempt to create, as I call it, a utopian organization out of disparate cultures, countries, financial systems, banking systems, and almost anything else you'd like to work, languages as well. But before we do that, let's take a step back and start. I mean, you can start in two ways with this topic. You can start from the grand view, or you can start from the specific view. And I think in this case, we'll understand more about what's going on if we start with Greece and the conditions of Greece. The European Monetary Union, as with the European Union, is a political entity. Its purpose is political. Its purpose is not financial. Its purpose is to forestall, prevent, make impossible another 20th century for Europe. Of all the centuries since the Black Death, or maybe the fall of the Roman Empire in the West, the 20th century was the most disastrous for Europe. 2 world wars, a depression, tens of millions dead, world leadership lost, and I would say one of the results of that is lack of confidence in the future in Europe. If you look at the birth rates across Europe, they are all below replacement. To me, those are cultures that no longer believe in their own future. At any rate, that's the grand view. The political union depends on the individual countries. Democracy is a slow operator. It takes a long time for people to change their attitudes on things and for those changes to be reflected in the politics. But reflected in the politics in democracies, they will. And there is a conundrum for the Europeans in that what they thought was the best, the most necessary approach to union is providing just the opposite impetus at the national level. Greece is the first example. But let's take a look at what's actually going on in Greece before we examine the financial situation and what actually transpired last week on Friday and Monday when the Greeks basically capitulated completely as to what was being demanded from Europe. Okay, let's take a look first at Greek GDP. This is Greek GDP. Remember, this is a background as to what is actually going on in Greece. This is Greek GDP. Peak was about here in 2008. It is now down 25% on its total. It has not recovered. Almost every other country in the world has recovered at least this is absolute volume of GDP. This is not percentage. This is actual GDP in billions of euros. This is from the Cleveland Fed. They have a great series of charts. It's very extensive. You'll see it quoted everywhere. I kind of like it that it's called Fred. For some reason, Fred seems to be in English, one of those moderately humorous names. I'm not sure why. Every language has things which to other languages sound funny. I know in Korean, the the name for addition, the words for addition and subtraction just sound funny to Western ears, to English ears, English-speaking ears. Anyway, never mind. So this is the background. Beyond everything else in Greece, this is the background. 25% down GDP. Imagine wherever you are. I'm in New York, but imagine the U.S. GDP is about, I think, 14 trillion. A quarter of that is maybe 4.5 trillion. Imagine if our GDP here in the United States or anywhere else in the EU, anywhere else, was a quarter lower. Think of the social, the cultural ramifications of this. Okay. Another examination of Greek problems. This one, Greek unemployment. And if one thing you can be sure about this chart is that it understates what's going on. 25% unemployment currently, and it has been above 20% for 1, 2, 3.5 years. Again, translate this to your own countries, to the United States. This is about the peak. Yes. Service value, usually corrected for prices. So it's called real GDP generally. In a year, that's correct. It's the size of the production of the economy's products, manufacturing and service, yes. And actually, you know, in the United States here, because GDP, not to be cynical about this, but because GDP wasn't performing adequately, they decided to include intellectual property as well, which is very hard to price. Nevertheless, so even in the United States, we have intellectual property. That's not true in other countries. The Europeans are actually more conservative, both in their inflation numbers and in their GDP numbers. Okay. This is about the height of the unemployment in the United States during the Depression, the Great Depression. So that's part of the background. Let's see what else we have here. Retail sales. Remember, the Greek crisis blew up in the beginning of 2010 when Greece, the current, I think that was Papandreou's government, admitted that their budget deficit was far greater than they knew, than they had admitted, and on and on and on. Now, going back to Greece's place in the EMU, it's well established and since admitted that Greece fudged its books. Fudged is putting it mildly. Fudge means a little correction to a zero or maybe the ones place. Greece basically made it up wholesale. Not quite, but close to it as far as how they were going to get under the Maastricht limits. But, and I've said this in a number of presentations, the idea that Greece was doing this and pulling the wool over its fellow Europeans' eyes is preposterous. The idea that Paris and Berlin and London and every other European capital and the chancelleries there and the finance ministries did not know that Greece was lying is nonsense. They knew. You're not going to find a memorandum in, you know, from Wolfgang Schaeuble to Angela Merkel or saying, you know what, the Greeks are lying there, we shouldn't let them in. The entire force, the entire momentum for increasing the euro, the membership of the euro, was all that counted. There's a bit of, as I said earlier, a utopian spirit to this. The problem with all utopian plans, well, that's a year on, yes, the retail sales number there is a year-on-year number, which are not always the best numbers, you know, because if you have a very low, it's a comparative number. So if you have a low GDP or whatever it is, retail sales the year before, then you're going to get an increase. It's like some of the increases after, like this increase, these increases right here, year on year, they look much stronger than they actually are because what they are is they're an increase on this decrease. So yes, No, it's the increase in retail sales year to year. That's what it is. So this is a year-on-year change number. The prior GDP number, this one is an absolute number. This is the absolute number. Okay, and I'm going to show you an interesting chart in a minute on GDP. Where was I? So that's the one downside sometimes of answering questions. You can lose your place. The Europeans knew that this was going on. This was going down. One thing that's true of all utopian systems is they seem to mandate a different species taking place under the desire, the utopian plans, and actually exists. Okay, so Greece retail sales improved somewhat up here, down again. Many questions about how accurate Greek statistics are, and I'll show you another reason why I say that. This is Greek GDP from Bloomberg. This is percent change, okay, year to year. This is fourth quarter. I do not understand this. It appears to me that for the percent change, the Greeks simply stopped reporting their numbers. Or that the numbers that are reported are so routinely disbelieved that we don't have anything here until the fourth quarter of 2014 that's on anything but the zero line. Certainly in this period right here, certainly from 2010 on, Greek GDP was not flat. It was falling because we have this number here. Okay? That's absolute size of GDP from 2008 on, but from 2010, certainly it goes into steep decline. So these numbers are not accurate. And I just wonder, frankly, why Bloomberg puts them up, but they do. Okay. This is the Greek manufacturing PMI from Market, which is a London company. 50%, 50 is the dividing line between positive and expansion and contraction. And you can see that, again, we're down here. It briefly touched here. Remember, this reason this only goes to 212 is because Market only started producing these numbers back in 2012. But as you can see, for all, and this extends down rather than up, prior years into 11 and 10, that for all of this period here, Greek manufacturing, such as it is, and I don't really know, I'm not an expert in the Greek economy, was negative, was contracting the entire time. Let's take a look at another telling statistic. Greek inflation, headline, what we would call headline CPI. The Europeans uniformly look at headline CPI, including food and energy prices, on the very sensible premise that people pay those things, that energy and food are necessities of life, and that what the price changes in those categories matters. And that not only that, but the price changes in those categories affect people's view of inflation. I went to the market a couple of days ago to buy something for dinner, and I was astonished at how much meat prices were here in the New York area. I mean, I don't usually shop, and I was absolutely astonished. And so I asked a few people, and they said, "Oh, yes, it's been going up for months and months and months and years." So this stuff really does matter. Anyway, so this is Greek CPI. So what do we have? Well, since 2013, we have deflation. Not disinflation. We have disinflation from 2010. Matter of fact, almost from the moment that the Greeks admitted that things weren't hunky-dory. I wonder where that phrase comes from, hunky-dory. I have to look that up. It's fascinating. Languages, if you pay attention to the origins of words and phrases, it's fascinating because some of these things go back hundreds of years and describe situations or technologies that we don't even use anymore. Anyway. One of my favorites is 3 sheets to the wind for someone who's had a little too much to drink. That comes from sailing ship days. The sheets are the lines that secured the sails. And if the sheets, the lines were loose, then the ship was careening wildly across the ocean. Anyway, sorry about that. So almost from 2010 on, Greece has been in deflation. In 2013, it entered actually it's been in disinflation, where the inflation rate is falling, and since almost the beginning of 2013, now entering its third year and again dropping, Greece has been in actual deflation. Now, one of the curious things that I've been to Athens quite a few times, although not within the past 2 years. And I have some other reports from my family who vacationed in Greece, and things have changed. Well, Dory is a type of rowboat, a double-ended type of rowboat that was often used on the Grand Banks from the 16th century on. But I thank you for that. But I wonder if there's any connection here. Probably if one is Dutch, then the other is Dutch, and we'll have to look it up. But I thank you for that. What's true, which is not reported in Greece, and it's very difficult to get a hold of it. I remember I read an article. So you wonder, Greece is not a third world country. It's a first world country. You go to Athens, it's a little dirtier than it used to be. There are more closed stores than it used to be. But people, I have friends there. I'm in communication with them all the time. Greece is working. Maybe not as well as it was. They're not happy. There are many, many accommodations. And how is this possible? If the economy is 25% smaller, because my guess is the underground economy, the black market, the gray market, whatever you want to call it, is probably more than 25% larger than it was. I've seen OECD studies saying that the Greek black market is 25% of the economy. It's probably a lot more than that now. So that is how people are surviving. Things are not reported. Greeks have a history going back for cultural reasons, probably to the Ottoman occupation for several hundred years, of not reporting things to the government, shall we say. The Italians have the same way. The loyalty to the national government is far less, and the identification with the national government is probably far less than we're used to here in the United States. And that is involved in the cultural and political history of the countries. We'll leave that aside. So that is how Greece is surviving. Now, let's move to the situation of the Greek bailout. We can start from the recent election, barely 3 weeks ago, a month ago, where Syriza, I think that's how you pronounce it, and Alexis Tsipras were elected. And they were elected on a dual, if you'll pardon me from borrowing the words, because I know Janet Yellen is testifying again in front of Congress today. It's amazing. She was pretty much up there yesterday saying, well, the economy, we're going to raise rates more or less, and the bond market went up. I guess they don't believe it. Anyway, they were elected on a dual mandate to eliminate, or at least to alleviate, the austerity program imposed by the Europeans, fronted by the Troika, the ECB, the IMF, and the EU Commission, but in fact inflicted by the Germans and the Northern Europeans, the Germans being the prime funders of it because they have the most money. So the Greeks want that changed. Syriza and Tsipras ran on that platform. The end of austerity. But he has a problem. The Greeks, by a wide majority, I think 70%, want to stay in the euro. These two desires are not compatible. Period. And we just found that out. The only power that the Greeks have is a credible threat to leave the euro. That's the only bargaining point they have. The Germans don't care what the Greeks think about austerity. The Germans don't care that the Greeks are suffering. I'm going to read a quote from John Maynard Keynes, and you'll see if anybody knows what it's from. But it's an interesting counterpoint to where we are now, almost exactly 100 years later from that quote. The idea, much promoted by the markets, that the Greeks would be able to go into these negotiations and get concessions from the Germans was farcical, at least at this point. One of the things I think that undermined any chance for the Greeks to do this, no responsible government can threaten, and I'm assuming I know nothing about Mr. Tsipras and Varoufakis, who seems like a pretty cool guy, and you can see I'm much in favor of his hairdo, but that's another question entirely. Could go into these negotiations with any sense of accomplishment, with any sense of strength, with any ability to make points against the Germans. You know, this setup has the sort of the makeup of classical tragedy. The Greeks are right in the things that they say, despite the fact that they didn't tell the truth before. And the Germans are right in what they say too. But the two are necessarily incompatible. The problem with the EU and the EMU, beyond everything else, is that it does not make Italians and Greeks and Spaniards and French into Germans and vice versa. But we will not deal with the cultural aspect of it today. So when Tsipras and Varoufakis went into these negotiations, I do not know, they're new, both of them, to the international stage. They are new to the heavyweights of politics. They are not going to, in this case, bluff the Germans. And the reason isn't so much, I can't answer that question. It's a complicated question, so I can't deal with that one. My background is my father is Italian, and so I've spent a lot of time in Italy and have relatives and family there. So I look at this from many points of view. But anyway, I'm not going to go on to the cultural aspect of it today, because I'd never stop, because I find it fascinating. The idea that Tsipras, none whatsoever, no problem. Don't worry about it. I'm not. It's not an issue. Believe me, I will make the same jokes myself. The negotiations that they entered into, they had no chance of success. And the idea that they could walk into this and bluff the Germans because they have a democratic mandate from the Greek people to do something is nonsense. And the strongest reason is the Greek banking system. Without support, remember Cyprus, where they did a haircut not just on debt, they did a haircut on bank accounts. That means if you had your money in a Cyprus bank account and you had $100,000 there, the government told you, no, you don't. You've only got $75,000 there. A tremendously poor precedent anytime a banking system or people who have cash in a banking system think that there's a crisis coming. So what was going on in the weeks leading up to these negotiations? The Greeks were pulling their money hand and fist out of the Greek banking system. Wouldn't you? You wire it someplace else. You wire it to France, you wire it to Italy, you wire it to Switzerland, someplace else where it's still in euros. You're not going to get a haircut if something happens, and it's not suddenly going to become a worthless drachma. So as that happened, the Greek banking system had no choice but to get liquidity from the ELA program. I forget what that's, extended liquidity assets. I forget what it stands for from the ECB. That necessity put the collapse of the Greek financial system not on a 1 month or a 2 month program. Some of the other time frames that you've heard, they're going to run out of, because Greece is not broke. As a matter of fact, as you keep saying, I'll talk about it in a minute, but they're running a primary surplus. Primary surplus means before interest payments. That's a big before, a really big before. But if Greece suddenly decides to default, it means the government will have money, just not enough. Thank you. Emergency liquidity assistance. I was close, but not very. So Greece's problem, when Mr. Tsipras and Mr. Varoufakis showed up to negotiate, was not that maybe at the end of March, maybe in May, maybe in June, they're going to run out of money, even if they refuse, as they said they would, to extend the bailout program. The reason they didn't want to extend the bailout program is because extending the bailout program means accepting the terms. And they were, so they said anyway, dead set on rejecting these terms, on not extend. That's why they said, we will not extend the bailout. Of course they did, but never mind. So the problem for them wasn't that, I think the problem is twofold. I think the problem is initially conceptually and secondly practically. Let's deal with the practical first. It's not that they have 3 months to prepare. They have 2 days. Because if they reject and the negotiations fall apart and there is no further discussion, at that point, the ECB most likely, acting as the enforcer for its government, which is the EU Commission, and the fact that if you think that the ECB is independent, it ain't. It's not, excuse me. The purpose of the ECB, the basic purpose of any central bank, is the lender of last resort, to prevent the collapse of the banking system. Even if Greece rejected the terms of a bailout extension and walked out of the negotiations, they would still be members of the EMU. Their central bank would still be under the aegis of the ECB, and it would still, by the definition of what the ECB is supposed to do, require the ECB, as long as Greece is a member of the euro, to extend liquidity assistance as the lender of last resort, the primary function of any central bank, to the Greek central bank. But my guess is, although it wasn't quite public, that the ECB very unequivocally said, if you don't accede to these demands and walk out of these negotiations, then we will stop the ELA assistance and the Greek banks would collapse. Because everybody knows how banks work, right? You have 10% of your assets on deposit and everything else is belief. People keep their money in banks because they believe that the banks are solvent. If people believe banks are not solvent, they all rush and they have a bank run and banks collapse. And that's what is meant by the emergency liquidity assistance. They give Greeks banks money so that as the withdrawals come in, they can be handled. Because otherwise the banks run out of money, they no longer exist. This is what happened in the 30s before FDIC. People lost all their money, all their funds, because the banks collapsed. The banks, as we all know, banks never have enough money. It's in a sense, it's an accepted confidence game. Banks never have enough money on hand to handle withdrawals if everybody comes at the same time. So that is the gun that was at the Greeks' head. It wasn't a 3-month way to plan. It was 2 days, 3 days. And clearly, the Greeks were not prepared to do that. Okay, now let's look, and that's why they lost. And that's why the program that the Greeks have agreed to, this 4-month bailout period, they essentially lost on every single request except for language. They're calling things differently than they used to in the memorandum. But the terms were the German terms, were the Northern European terms. I'm going to read a quote now. Let's see if anybody can guess where this is from. It's a very famous quote. It is extraordinary that the fundamental economic problems of a Europe starving and disintegrating before their eyes was the one question in which it was impossible to arouse their interest. It's not a test. That was written by John Maynard Keynes, I think, in his The Economic Consequences of the Peace in 1919 at the Versailles Conference, where he was actually a Treasury minister, a Treasury official in the British government of David Lloyd George, at which he resigned because he thought that the terms of the treaty were far too harsh. This is what Alsey said. It's fascinating comparison. We are now 100 years later. This is what he said about the Versailles Treaty, which imposed huge reparations payments on Germany. They settled it as a problem of theology, of politics, of electoral chicanery, from every point of view except that of the economic future of the state whose destiny they were handling. That is exactly what is going on now. And I'd like to give credit. That was from I found those quotes in an article by Liam Halligan, I believe, of the Telegraph. Yes, the Telegraph, the UK paper. Unless the euro serves to benefit its members, all of its members, it cannot survive. So let's go back to the terms now of the actual agreement, okay? This is some of the things that the Greeks, when they enter the negotiation, a lot of this is due, I think, to the naivete, perhaps, and the rhetoric. I mean, Alexis Tsipras has to be at least before. His party came from nowhere. The Greek established political parties have collapsed, basically. First, the socialists of Papandreou, who were in charge, PASOK, when in 2010, when the chicanery, to borrow a word from Mr. Keynes, actually Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, it's Keynes. Keynes is the planetologist from Dune. My apologies. John Maynard Keynes, sorry. Anyway, so PASOK, which was the party, the Socialist Party in power in 2010, when this all started, and the New Democracy Party of Antonis Samaras, who negotiated the bailout terms, which are roundly hated in Greece. So the Greeks entered the negotiations refusing to extend the bailout. They wanted to have the $7 billion that was still there released to them. They wanted to change the primary surplus that they were being required to run at 4.5% and drop it to 1.5%. They wanted to stop privatization sales. They wanted to stop the firing of government employees. They wanted to increase minimum wage. And they were requesting initially, although they dropped this one before the negotiation even started, a write-down on the existing debt. Greece will, all of these from John Maynard Keynes' point of view are correct. The Greek economy is 25% smaller than it was. Whatever the purpose, unless the purpose of the bailout was to punish Greece for lying, in which case it's very effective, much as the Treaty of Versailles' purpose was to punish Germany because they lost, and because by the victors, Britain, France, the United States, they were viewed as being culpable for the war. I have nothing to say about that topic, although it's a fascinating topic. If the purpose of this agreement was to punish Greece, it's effective. If its purpose was to make sure that the euro works. It's an utter failure. Remember, no, let me go back to this thing. So for Greece, every item that they came with either before the negotiations started, as in the debt reduction, or all of the other items, they've lost. They've not on a single one of them. Greek debt is now, I believe I have it here. Here's debt to GDP. Let's look at a couple of those, okay? To see how, and you know, this doesn't just apply. Remember what I said about banks? Banks are essentially a confidence game. They work because nobody does a bank run. The amount of debt that's outstanding in the world right now is also a confidence game. This debt will never be paid back. I'm trying not to sound like a libertarian here. Okay, Greek debt, 175% of GDP. Okay, it used to be 120. It's now gone up. Let's take a look here. Some comparisons. Italian debt to GDP, 133%. Not good. Germany, United States, 71. Remember, this is just government sovereign debt. If you put all the debt of the economy in there, it's much, much higher. And Germany, a little bit higher than the United States. There's a big run-up back here when Germany absorbed East Germany, when West Germany absorbed East Germany. I do realize my kids are never going to know. They're going to ask me one day what they're going to come across in some history book. They're going to go West Germany, East Germany. They're going to say, what is that? They're going to come across the USSR. They're going to say to me, what is that? Anyway, so the items that Greece came to the negotiations with have all been denied, and rather summarily denied. I don't know if Mr. Varoufakis thought that his academic specialty of game theory would help him here, but these men, whatever their intentions, did not come to this negotiation with the hand that they thought they came with. The idea, just as they are responsible to their people, their democratic institutions, so are the Germans. And the German view is what we're talking about here. The German view of the Greeks having borrowed more, that's true. Let's make an analogy here to the private sector. If someone who, by the standards of the bank, should not qualify for the loan, such as the late housing crisis, subprime housing crisis in the United States, what happens when they can't pay? Who takes the loss? The lender. They write off the loan. You can't get, as the phrase goes, blood from a stone. Someone's bankrupt, you can't get any money from them. Would a bank, a private sector bank, knowing that someone can't pay their mortgage, force that person to take a loan and then get it right back as payment on the mortgage? Does that make any sense? Obviously, the answer doesn't have to be said. Well, that is exactly what's going on here with Greece. The idea that the lenders to Greece in the heyday of Greek debt accumulation, let's take a look again here, right? Before 2010, now this is even worse, but from all this period here, and there's more back here, did not know, much as the European chancelleries knew that Greece was lying on their application to the euro. They didn't care. This is exactly what was going on. For the lenders to insist is, shall we say, counterproductive. Part of the reason is because the politicians tend to take in public a very simplistic view of this. They borrowed the money, they owe it to us. The other reason is a lot of these loans are on the books of the European banking system. If they go bankrupt, as they are. Greece is bankrupt. It cannot pay back its loans. It will never be able to pay back its loans. By the way, neither will the United States. We're going to inflate it away. We have $18 trillion in sovereign debt, and everybody believes it's good. We'll just keep issuing more. We can issue dollars. Greece cannot issue euros. That's the difference. So Greece cannot pay back this debt, period. In a normal situation, private sector situation, the debt would be written down and written off the books of the banks as bad debt. The people would be bankrupt. And then here in the United States, we're relatively lenient about this. They would declare bankruptcy, and in a few years, they would be back in business. This is what corporations do, but apparently not Greece. Yes, Greece took out, as if Greece is an entity, but the Greeks in general borrowed far more money. They spent it frivolously, if you will. That's certainly the German view. I do not have a view on this. And they can't pay it back now, and they're never going to be able to pay it back. How do you pay back a debt load that's gone from 120 to 175% of GDP in 4 years when your economy is now 25% smaller? There is zero logic to this. It is short-sighted in the extreme. It is no different. That's true. There are a lot of good points to that, and you would make this point. This is the point from the German side, that the Greeks' economy is never going to grow under its current system because it's corrupt and because it's oligarchic and it's hugely inefficient. That may be. But the other question, the more important question is the German hammer going to be able to change that? And that's a very questionable. And in fact, whose responsibility is that? Okay, let's move on. So the idea that the Greeks will ever pay back this debt on an economy that's 25% smaller is farcical. Okay, so what actually was the result of the negotiations and the agreement that the Greeks agreed to? You notice we got an agreement right here. The euro has not gone up. This agreement, I mean, what is it that Marshal Foch said about, and it's unfortunate that all of the analogies that I'm using here keep going back to the First World War, but wasn't Marshal Foch said, hearing of the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, he said, this is not a peace treaty, it's a armistice for 20 years, which was almost exactly accurate. The war started again in 1939. The terms of the agreement, I think, are going to force the Greeks to reassess their position. Now, so what exactly did change in this agreement? What did they talk? I mean, they signed an agreement and the words are different. Well, the existing program is now called, that's the bailout program, is now called an arrangement. The extension is now called the framework of the arrangement. So they've changed the words on it. But in the memo, it says this. Only, remember, because it's paid off with inflated dollars that are worth less. That's how. So if you have, if you owe, people who borrow love inflation and people who lend don't like inflation. But let me take that. Let me do that with that minute. Let me finish where I am now. This is from the agreement. Only approval of one of the problems one of the points of contention and how this all got started was that the Troika, the EU Commission, the IMF, and the ECB send their inspectors to Greece to ascertain whether the Greeks are agreeing, are living up to the terms of the agreement. Guess what? They're not. And it became the Greek government of Samaras would say, well, we really are, but in fact they weren't. But once they elected Tsipras, his campaign was based on getting rid of austerity. So you could no longer pretend, as Samaras was trying to do, that we are working towards, the terms of the agreement, the bailout agreement, with their privatization sales and rationalizations of labor market and on and on and on. But you couldn't pretend anymore, which Samaras and his government was trying to do. So the inspectors left Greece. They could not certify that the Greeks are living up to their agreement. And they were not. And with that, the last $7 billion of the bailout agreement would not be released to the Greeks. Now, the Greeks saying they're owed $1.9 billion in interest payments on something. Okay, I don't know the details of that, to tell you the truth. So they did not get that money. Now, that $7 billion was not going to throw the Greeks into immediate default. It was the banking system that I spoke about. But this is from the agreement. Excuse me. Only approval of the conclusion of the review of the extended arrangement. They're now calling it an arrangement, not a bailout. By the institutions will allow for any disbursement of the outstanding tranche of the current EFSF program. That's the program. That's the technical name for it. And the transfer of the 214 S&P profits, that's $1.9 billion, to which Greece is entitled. Both, again, are subject to the approval of the Eurogroup. Nothing has changed. Not only did they not change the terms of the agreement, they are still subject to the same inspection that they were before. It is very easy to say that Tsipras's approach to the 5 minutes, we have an early finish today. Sorry, folks, didn't know that. Okay, but that's all right. I'm almost done with this, so we can finish this. Could they borrow more? Well, let me just finish this point, and then I'll tell you where I think we're going to go with this, because I do want to finish that. The essence of this agreement is that Greece has won no points, that Syriza's election and the democratic wishes of Greece have mattered not a bit. You can argue whether they should or they shouldn't, but have mattered not a bit in these negotiations. So where does this turn? Remember how it started. Tsipras and Syriza were elected with what I felt was a totally unrealistic point of view. The Greek people themselves, in my view, are being unrealistic, and now they're faced with the results of that. They wanted to end austerity, and they wanted to stay in the euro. You can't stay in the euro because the extenders of credit will not permit it. This denouement, this agreement, will, if conditions do not improve in Greece, if the European economies as a whole do not improve, will only make it clearer and clearer and clearer that Greece, as government, as society, as culture is constituted now, cannot and will soon realize it does not want to exist under the rule of the Northern European euro, which is what we have. You could take a conspiratorial point of view and say what's going to happen here, and I do not do this, but it is a possibility, so I thought I'd mention it, that the government of Tsipras knew that they could not exit the euro now. The country would descend, and no responsible leader can do that. The country would descend into absolute chaos, I assume, financial chaos, once the ELA assistance was cut off by the ECB. What does this agreement give them? Well, it gives them 4 months to plan, perhaps to exit the euro. We won't know. It will also give and it's a fascinating topic, will in 4 months Greek popular opinion evolve so quickly that it realizes that they cannot have their euro cake and eat it at the same time? I don't know. Will the government of Alexis Tsipras begin to sell and lead a Greek exit in public? It's possible. I doubt it. I don't know what kind of man he is or what his beliefs are. But at the very least, this gives, because this is going to come back up in 4 months. And it's going to come back and come back and come back because the euro simply does not work for the current construction of the Greek economy, period. Period. Germany, at this negotiation, remember what I said earlier, the only leverage Greece has at these negotiations is a credible threat to leave the euro. They did not have a credible threat at this negotiation. They may have a far more credible threat at the next negotiation in 4 months because there's going to be another negotiation. And then there's going to be another and another. You cannot fix. Well, that's true, except that the Greeks hate austerity. And it is, remember, the Greek economy is 25% smaller. Now, that is not the whole story. If the Greek economy is 25% smaller, the Greek black economy is 25% larger, my guess. So it's not as terrible. I think I haven't been to Greece in 3 years, so I'm not sure what it's actually like in Athens. I mean, I see these pictures from Parliament Square, and that's where I always used to stay, right around there. So I know the area very, very well. And the Greeks are kind of reluctant to talk about it because a lot of it is, at least the ones that I know, a lot of it is coping with very unpleasant things. Anyway. So the current, if you will, Versailles Treaty on Greece will not work. You cannot pay off this amount of debt by lending people money and think things are going to get better. They're not. The debt's got to be written down. And if the Europeans don't want to deal with it, then what the Greeks do, I mean, look, many nations have defaulted. They're in the they're in the corner for a few years and they come back out again. Exactly would be the same for Greece. I'm not arguing what the Greeks should do. But I am wondering now, the display of intransigence on the part of the creditors is not going to be beneficial to the entire Euro EMU project. Greece is simply an example. Italy has not grown in over a decade. Its economy has not grown in over a decade. Spain is now, I think, back to where it was in 2008 as far as the size of its economy. It's very debatable whether or not the euro project, and that, of course, is what we're talking about here. We're not simply talking about Greece, can continue indefinitely on these terms. The first crisis, I mean, economic crises happen regularly. That's a good question. It's going to be beyond the scope here. I know I have to end. What happened to the euro? The euro would be forced to be much more accommodating to the its members' needs. Remember, the European debt policy is formulated to benefit primarily Germany. And that would have to change. I think the shock to the idea of European unity, if the Greeks leave, would be profound. And so that, I think, is where we will end up in 4 months. Okay, folks, I thank you very much for listening. I know that we have a little bit of a short version here. I often run over 15 minutes. Again, thank you very much for attending. It is appreciated. Thank FX Street, Adinda, and Maud for putting these on. I will put my email address on the chat. If you have any questions or would like to see any of the charts or anything else that I have put together, I did not use some of them. I have some other charts. I will be happy to send them to you and answer any questions that you have. Again, thank you all very much for attending. It's been a pleasure, and we'll do this again in about 2 weeks. Take care.